Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. I'm in the Rowan Atkinson slot this morning to offer my thoughts on electric vehicles. Very glad to be here this morning. And I wanted to start just by saying congratulations to Zemo for 20 years, which is fantastic. My organization, the Climate Change Committee, is only 15 years old. So we are cousin organizations. We've been together on this journey now for 15 years. And it is absolutely fabulous to hear Andy talk about what we thought 20 years ago and where we might end up in the future. I would encourage you all to take a leaf out of the CCC's book, actually, and actually don't try and project the future, but actually stand in the future and look back. That's basically what we do. And it gives you lots of kind of insights about how the world could be moving right now and how we might move it more quickly. I absolutely do want to look forward, though, today. So we're going to try and give you some sense of how, at least in the CCC, we see that transition taking place over the course of the next 20, 30 years or so. And I might just adapt Seb's opening comment if he's still here. Wouldn't it be nice if we could be outside enjoying a nice day and not think that we are also cooking the planet? So I think that's the goal here. It's some way off, but this stuff, the thing that we'll talk about today, is really now central to that story overall. So let me begin then. What does that future look like? What does it look like for the whole economy to get to net zero? I was promised a big screen, and here it is. This is the chart that is entirely visual. Don't worry, you don't need to look at every line on this chart, but this is how we think about the challenge of net zero for the whole economy. Each one of those lines on that spaghetti chart is a sector. Each one of those is a different story playing out, how we decarbonize that sector, putting policy in place, scaling up the policies, scaling up deployment, building supply chains, stimulating the consumers. That's what gets you to net zero. The reason I show this chart is because the one at the very top there is surface transport. So if we just highlight that there today, the goal today is to take surface transport from being the highest emitting sector to being one of the lowest emitting sectors, probably in the mid-2040s. So if you think about that path ahead, if I'd stood on this stage 15 years ago when the CCC was first created and talked about a path that radical, I don't think it would have been credible. But that's where we are now. Zero carbon transport as quickly as possible, preferably in the early 2040s. It is absolutely possible to do that because of the rapid transition we're seeing in some of the technologies, but crucially also because I think the country's ready for it. So I made a quip about Rowan Atkinson. He's fundamentally wrong about some of the things that we are seeing, I think, playing out now in the transport market. But that is the goal. So how is that achieved? Well, that's the key question. And this is, I think, a more useful chart, which hopefully you'll be able to see. This is the same chart, actually, looking at the transport sector. And the main thing I want to tell you today is that we did this chart for what was called the 6th carbon budget. Some of you in the room will know what that was. That was the analysis that we produced back a few years ago now to inform the path for the legal targets that were then set. And we are now in the midst of gearing up for the next one of those. So the 7th carbon budget, believe it or not, is not far off. So we're planning to do that early. So we're going to do that in early 2025. So that it's ready for whatever government we have in early 2025. It will be new in its inception, maybe a new government. I'm not making that prediction this morning. But this is very important, this particular sector, and this is what we'll be looking at again. So let me explain what you're seeing on this chart. The top line is what we call our baseline. That's what we would expect in a world where we turn off climate policies, including those in the transport sector. The purple-blue line at the bottom is the one I've just shown you. So that's the path ahead for the transport sector. And the stripes in between are what take you from that baseline to the bottom line, the abatement as we call it. It's fascinating to look at this. This is, well, I think it is anyway. This is what tells you the story of what we have in that pathway in which we'll be looking at again. The biggest contribution is the green bit. So that is the transition that we're seeing now in zero emission vehicles, mainly electric. 100% of all new sales, cars and vans, by the early 2030s. You can probably see the orange bit there, that's HGVs. That's a little later, so you can see that scaling up, shown by the orange wedge. And on top of this, and I do want to make this point this morning, the bit that makes this tick And the bit that probably I'm most worried about when I stand back and look at all this is that wedge at the top, the purple wedge. That's us reducing car miles traveled, car travel demand, 17% by 2050 from where we are today, roughly. And that is a big challenge, one which, understandably, ministers are less keen to talk about, but that's what makes this transition possible. And we need it to be in there alongside all the great stuff that's happening on zero-emission vehicles, and, of course, improving the efficiency of existing fossil fuel vehicles alongside that. The other bit to comment on, which I'll come back to, is vans. So vans is the bit that concerns me when I look forward at the moment, but some hope perhaps that we can change that. Now, it's great to have this, great to have a modeled outcome, but let's talk about what actually drives that. And in my organization, we've been producing charts like this for several years. We didn't quite have this one 15 years ago, but we now have quite a sophisticated view of how each sector in the economy can deliver that kind of carbon abatement. We want to turn that into something that is more real world. We want to talk about the actual change that we would be seeing around us today if that were happening. And happily, we've been building a better way of thinking about that real world change with something that we call monitoring maps. Think of these as the sort of logic model through which you might achieve an outcome like that. So this is what they look like. We publish these, and in about 2 weeks' time, we will publish a brand new version of this in our annual progress report. I would encourage you all to have a look at that and to watch the launch of that on the 28th of June. This is now absolutely fundamental to the way that we think about progress in this country. Basically, what we're looking at is those spaghetti lines that I showed you at the start, starting at the top with an anchor goal, moving down then to the outcomes that we would be seeing if that anchor goal was being achieved, into the enablers of that, into the policies that drive that, pushing policies down to that level because policies change, but the outcomes do not. And then underneath that, some sense of what the contextual factors, particularly those international factors, would look like. In the surface transport sector, we probably have the most elegant understanding, I think, of what that would look like. So let me just take you through that in outline. So at the top, the anchor target, which is not a CCC target, it was once, it's now the government's own target, is to reduce surface transport emissions by 3/4 relative to 2019 by 2035. That is the government's target. It's wonderful to have that in place. Hugely ambitious, hugely achievable. I think we need to move on from talking about emissions into this stuff. So this is what drives that. This is probably the most important element of that, of this tree that I'm showing you here. The outcomes that would drive that. Now, you will see in 2 weeks' time, we collect information, some metrics about each of these outcomes, but broadly what you see in this sector is something on the right there about our demand for travel, looking at reduced demand for carbon-intensive modes of travel, also shifting to low-carbon modes. You can see all of this, and we publish it. And then on the left, looking at what we do about the vehicles on the road and rail, and how we reduce the vehicle emissions there. And of course, big story there about the uptake of zero-emission vehicles and improving the efficiency of conventional vehicles alongside all of that. What's great about this is that we have a strong sense now about what that path ahead would look like with those key metrics, which allow us to do this annual progress reporting based on actual data that published annually. So it's very exciting to have that. Next, moving on to the next layer is the enablers of that. And here I think you will probably find most of the challenges that we face, particularly for electric vehicles at the moment. So we've got in here, for example, the supply of zero electric vehicles being a key part of the enabling of that, so the availability of zero-emission vehicle models. Come on to that in just a second. The charging infrastructure. I'm an electric vehicle driver up in Scotland, and the charging infrastructure is probably my biggest concern when I think about how I use that. Also the alternatives, the low-carbon options that you see on the right of this chart there. And I think really interesting, we're also now collecting information on public attitudes for all this. So bringing that into the assessment of progress that the country is making, the attitudes that people in this country and businesses have in this country to the low carbon transport transition, we can collect that too. And then on to the next stage, which is where we might have started 15 years ago, where we're doing our progress reporting, which is looking at the policies that we have in place, asking ourselves the question, do the policies that we have in place deliver the outcomes above it? And actually, we do have a pretty good policy mix in this country, we think, notably the ZEV mandate, a few other things in place too. We'll talk about charging infrastructure in just a second and the RTFO, but still a few things missing, perhaps. Questions about whether we might need things like scrappage schemes. If you wanted to go this faster, we could do something like that. And the big one, which I think we will have to come back to, bottom right in italics, road pricing. So this question of what we do with the tax system is, for me, the fundamental policy question for the next Parliament, and one which I do think we need to start talking about, because this is something that politicians typically have walked away from when they've been presented with those options to look at reforming the tax system. But if I were in the Treasury, I would see this transition now as a huge fiscal hole. And that means that this fiscal risk needs to be tackled properly with progressive policies that will help this transition, but also secure the tax state. Very finally, the last section on this is another interesting level. This is looking at what drives all of that more broadly, the contextual factors for that, thinking about things like jobs and skills, key to the transition, potentially could hold up the transition. Also looking at battery supply and prices, which has been heading in the wrong direction during a very difficult period, but we think is coming back to trend now. So really exciting to see that. And of course, energy prices, a key point too. I show you this and take you through this very deliberately because what I want to do is to try and build some consensus about the factors that are in this. Because if we build that consensus, then we'll have policies that are focused on what really drives the transition. This is the second year of us doing it. We try and refine it every year, but this is one that's really stuck. So I hope you can agree with some of that. All right. Coming towards the end, are we seeing, with all of that in place, the change that we really need to see across the country? And I think the story here is a mixed one, but still actually some quite exciting things within this, which reflect my positivity, I suppose, about the importance of this transition and how quickly it can move. One of the other reasons why I'm excited about transport transition is because it's also the biggest story, I think, in the energy transition. So you've got this combination of energy policy, energy transition with the transport transition. Really exciting to see that take place. It can make us drive towards net zero even more quickly. Let's start with electric car sales. The positive story here is that we are seeing now actual sales of electric cars, both battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, ahead of the pathways that we have in the CCC and the government's own pathways. In 2 weeks' time, we'll update this chart and we'll show you that it's still ahead, despite the stories that actually this is slowing up as a story. It's not. It's happening. We're seeing more and more of the actual sales of this ahead of the path that we need to be on. That's very, very positive. But total volumes of sales are behind, particularly because we've had this problem of the global semiconductor supply. So that we hope has to change, but the market share, which is the key thing, I suppose, for me, in terms of shares of vehicles, is running ahead of the path. Very exciting to see that, and I hope as we get past that kind of post-COVID semiconductor problem, we'll see that really accelerate. So that's the first thing to say. Next one, this is a tricky one to see from the back, but don't worry. Zero-emission vehicle sales, and this is us looking at the sales question now. Again, we have pathways for that. We've got strong support in there for deployment of zero-emission vehicle buses. Good to hear about buses. You'll see that cars and buses tracking ahead now of our own pathway, which is great news. Some concern I mentioned about vans. You can probably see that sort of red line at the bottom there isn't where the diamonds are. That's basically the story of us being behind the path on vans. So the van market is currently behind where it needs to be, but we're also starting to see that beginning to accelerate again because we've got this information now, we can look at that. So yes, there's more to do, but actually we think we can recover. It's very exciting to be able to say that. And then last of the charts I wanted to show you today, and probably this is the biggest challenge when I look at it, and this is EV charge points. Public charge points today, just under 40,000 of them. We need that to be more like 300,000 by 2030. So that means doing around 30,000 new installations each year. That means having a mix of rapid chargers and chargers up to about 40 kilowatts. We are behind on this. And this is, for me, a big challenge. I live in a flat in Scotland. I don't have a driveway. I'm at the mercy of the public charging network. You can probably see that map on the right there. You'll see that Scotland is in green, so it's one of the better areas, but I can tell you it's still a right pain trying to find a place to charge my car. So, this is a real issue. It's those social issues, public attitude towards that I think will gum us up, slow up this transition if we don't address it. That provision is inconsistent across the country. 5%, we reckon, of charge points are out of service. And you can't really predict where they are. So, that's way ahead of the government's own target of 1%. And then the other thing that's playing a factor here, of course, is cost. So we've seen huge increases in energy prices over the last 18 months or so. That has increased the per mile charging here very significantly, double where they were a couple of years ago, for example. But the per mile costs are still less than driving a petrol car. So there is still a cost advantage once you have that car on the road. Now on this, we reckon, Bob's going to speak in a second, the DFT strategy is pretty good on this. It's got all the roles and responsibilities that we would like to see, but it needs to turn into something deliverable. We need to actually see that shift happening on the ground, particularly in those areas that you see in orange. That's the area that we've got to go next. London sits right in the middle of that in green. We need to grow the story of this being, an everyday thing. The EV needs to be the kind of the obvious choice. And we see in the sentiment from the public, from business, that they're happy to move to EVs. This is the thing I think that will slow us up. So, very finally from that, going a little further into some of the things that we've collected, and this will be the final thing I talk about today. Another chart for you, just looking again, since we are reflecting on 20 years of Zemo, the long-term trends that you see here. That plummet that you see there, looking at 2011 on the left of this chart, and then where we are today on the right. The plummet in just a couple of years ago, of course, is the pandemic. Fascinating to see what's happened after the pandemic to each of these forms of transport. We are seeing now growth in road and rail travel, but a fall, sadly, in bus usage over the decades prior to the pandemic. Van and HGV traffic has already rebounded to levels that are higher than our pathway following the pandemic. We're seeing some things, I suppose, that worry us when you look at this. I'll come back to my point here about the need to focus on two really important things. One is the demand issue and the car miles traveled, not to lose the sense that we do need policy around that. But my final point is that we must not forget public transport provision in all of this. It is absolutely essential for us to have a fully functioning public transport network across the whole of the country, not just in London. And that bit, I think you probably see here, is that's why people are going back to their cars at the moment. And I do worry about that. If that's a trend that continues, then this is going to be a harder transition than it needs to be into the future. And we need some steely policy making to make that work. My final point to you this morning, just to make this kind of final point and end on a more optimistic note, it is so exciting now to see this take place. And we were not saying that 15 years ago. This is what we used to call one of the hard-to-treat sectors. This is the next in the frame. We've seen this remarkable stuff taking place in the energy sector. This is next. And I can't wait for it. I think it's going to be brilliant when we see this playing out. Prove the critics wrong and make this happen. And making this central now to the story of not just net zero, but also the commercial success of this country on this transition, the jobs that go with this, and of course the experience of people up and down the country with zero emission transport. It's going to be fantastic. So thank you very much.